author John Leake, and in my latest book, The Meaning of Malice, I examine the story of Sandra Bridewell, an alluring and very seductive socialite in Dallas, Texas in the 70s and 80s, who fell from grace when she fell under suspicion for a series of violent deaths. I spent the last 5 years investigating this trail of crime, violence, sex, blackmail, and murder. At every step of my investigation, I've run into a wall of silence that has allowed these violent deaths to remain unsolved and to perplex my community for the last 40 years. So what really happened? Let's take a closer look at the evidence.
All right, we got John Leake back. Thank you so much, John, for coming back again. A little bit different this time, but thank you.
Thanks for having me, Tommy.
So the first time was the COVID-19 with Peter McCullough, great book. Made a big splash with that. And this one here, we got a little bit something different with The Meaning of Malice, huh?
Well, also true crime. You may recall our conversation about our book about COVID-19. My perception of the pandemic response, the suppression of early treatment, and then this forcing an experimental product on all of mankind, I perceived that pandemic response to be a form of organized crime. And so I told Peter McCullough, you're the scientific expert witness. I am a true crime investigator. And so that's where I came from. And this story is one that I have followed since I was 17 years old. I should say just before my 17th birthday. This story hit the press in my native Dallas, Texas in a big way. It was a cover story on our glossy monthly magazine, D Magazine, and Sandra, that young lady right there, was on the cover of D Magazine, and the question was, is this lady a black widow?
And what is a black widow? For those who, I didn't know until you told me. When you told me about it, I thought black widow, a spider, you know?
Yeah, well, I think that it's kind of an old epithet in crime and the lore of crime and criminal investigations. A black widow is a woman whose husbands keep dying and she keeps collecting life insurance. I think that's the basic idea. And you know, for the spider, the black widow spider, she mates with a male, and then once he's done, once he's served his purpose, then she kills him.
Yeah, at least like when it comes to bumblebees, at least they sting and die. Don't they do their thing and die? Bees, I think.
Well, you're talking about a worker bee,
yeah,
honeybee. When he stings, he does die. His stinger will get the barb will catch and. That's the end of him. There's another insect in which the female, and there's probably multiple, but the other one I know of is the female praying mantis. She does the same thing as a black widow spider. It's interesting with the female praying mantis because the male praying mantis is actually in the act of copulation, and once she senses he's done, she has this scythe on the front leg. She'll just turn around and just cut his head off. Yeah, like in the middle of copulation. So that too is another interesting thing in the insect world.
And you know, those insects, they have to have some type of language. Like, hey, buddy, you know you're probably going to get your head cut off.
He doesn't care.
He just wants to be the one.
Yeah. He's so enjoying himself. He doesn't even realize.
Even though he's going to get decapitated.
Yeah. I mean, in humans, the human male has been known to to follow these instincts into a situation that can be rather dangerous. Yeah. I won't name any names.
Right. Yeah. Well, you're sitting across from one, possibly two, or 3 or 4. Another one that was funny, Gad Sad was in. He's with Jordan Peterson a lot. And he was showing these birds. I forget what type of bird it is, but they all go on this branch and they have these feathers. And it's whatever bird can go like this the best. And these birds dance all day long, and the female's just watching. And for the birds to do this, whichever one it is opening up to the predator. It's risking its life to do this dance for this bird. And the predators are just like, oh, it's time for them to dance. Can't wait. Which one do we want?
That's a comment. It's interesting we're talking about the natural world. White-tailed deer, I grew up hunting deer in Texas. You will have a buck, the male deer, who, when it's not mating season, he's the smartest guy in the world. You will never see him. You go hunting, try and find him when it's not mating season, you'll never see him. During mating season, when the does go into estrus and they produce this pheromone that he can smell, all caution thrown to the wind. He'll run right up to you. You can like whack him on the head with the barrel. So this is a common thing. The male in an amorous state loses his judgment.
And do you think that's tied in because we're meant to reproduce, even if that's risking life? Do you think that's how it all ties? Together?
This seems to be, the birds and the bees seem to be the principal driving force of all life. Look at all of the stupid stuff that we guys do to try and attract pretty girls.
True.
The whole sports automotive industry is predicated on that.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone would ever sell a Porsche 911 Turbo for 175 if it weren't for trying to impress girls. Anyway, that's kind of my
right.
sense.
I think when I was in high school, the whole thing was to get a nice car so you could go pick up that girl in the nice car and take her out to dinner. And even when you're older, even now, even now.
Now that we're...
So you have a sociopath, psychopath, and a serial killer.
Mm-hmm.
So could you explain what each one of those is in the best simple terms that you can?
I think the concept of psychopath is a very useful one. There is a pretty big literature on psychopathy. A guy named Robert Hare, a university professor in British Columbia, wrote a psychopathy checklist. So it's a series of character traits. The thing that we have to understand about human behavior is that we can't measure it like you can measure other things in nature. It's complex, it's unpredictable. But psychopaths have certain observable character traits. I call it a pattern of behavior that you see again and again. It's characterized in the plainest sense by a lack of empathy.
Okay, lack of empathy.
A lack of empathy. Other people are just there to serve your desires, whether it be for material gain or pleasure or whatever. And the psychopath doesn't have any feeling of empathy. What's it like to be this person? So following from that, very exploitative, using people until you get what you want from them and then discarding them. I think where psychopathy intersects with another kind of psychological disorder that you see manifest in relationships, in this case between a woman and male partners, is this pattern that you see repeatedly. The girl meets the guy. Initially, she perceives him to be a sort of Prince Charming. You're the guy of my dreams who I've been waiting for all of these years, like Prince Charming in the Cinderella fairy tale. There's an initial idealizing moment, oh, you're my hero. But then with the passage of time, with cohabitation, he shows that, well, he's not a Prince Charming. He's just an ordinary mortal man who has bad days and who doesn't always look that great. And maybe he's sick sometimes. Maybe he doesn't make that much money. Maybe he doesn't always do it for you in the bedroom, whatever the complaint may be. So then at that point, familiarity breeds contempt, and idealizing gives way to dehumanizing.
That's the key word, dehumanizing.
Dehumanizing. So you'll see this, well, you're not the man. You're not, in this case, in my story, the repetitive pattern that is documented, multiple witnesses. You must just not be the man I thought you were. And expressions of contempt, of anger and drama, and it all goes downhill quite quickly.
And in your book, it's no surprise to me that it seems to have started at childhood. And when you've done other true crime that may be similar to this, is there always something, a commonality, that something happened in childhood? Like with her, she was adopted in the 40s. Well, what's it like to be adopted in the 40s? Are you frowned upon that you're an adopted child?
Well, that's a very good question. The literature on adopted children, I think the findings are very varied. An adopted child can feel very wanted, very loved, and function very well in his or her adopted family. So that's a big generality. However, I will say this. The subject of my first book was also a guy of uncertain parentage. He didn't know who his father was. He wasn't adopted by his mother, but he was an illegitimate and placed in the custody of his grandfather, kind of dumped. So what seems to be perhaps a commonality is a child might feel like at some point, maybe I'm unwanted. And I think that's a distinct possibility with the subject of this book. As far as we know about Sandra's past, her childhood, she's born in 1944. She was an adopted child. When she was 2 years old, her adoptive mother was killed in a car accident in Dallas.
It's right there. Ugh.
So at what point a 2-year-old realizes my mother is gone? I mean, I don't know. But I think the most salient point is her adoptive mother was then replaced quite quickly by a stepmother.
Darce.
And so now we get into this archetypal story of Cinderella. And apparently, according to witnesses who went to high school with Sandra, she actually referenced the Cinderella story. She talked about my wicked stepmother. And other girls perceived she didn't seem to have a big aspiration of having a career or something like that. She really wanted to cultivate her charm, her ability as a homemaker, as a wife, as an attractive wife, and to meet a rich man.
And her stepmom locked her in a room, told her she was worthless, worth nothing.
So
that's a recipe for disaster, right?
Well, she told some friends, childhood schoolmates, that my stepmom is like the wicked stepmom in the Cinderella story, and has locked me in the closet, whipped me with willow branches, acted in a very imperious way, making her do housework, and if it's not done to absolute perfection, making her redo it. This kind of tyranny and expressions of you're worthless, you can't do anything, making her feel unloved. This is Sandra's representation of her childhood with her stepmom.
Do you find that to be fact?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was her claim. It was what she mentioned to friends when she was a girl. Perhaps it's true.
You would think so. How she turned out, and then in there, she didn't date much, right? Early on, she didn't date much.
Well, again, this is the witness testimony of girls that went to high school. She apparently was kind of a shy girl in high school. Now, when she graduated from high school, she went to a small college in Tyler, Texas, called Tyler Junior College. Now, that probably doesn't mean a lot to a nationwide audience, but Tyler is a town in the center of the East Texas oil patch. I mean, the great East Texas oil formation. And so some of the great fortunes of American petroleum industry were made in East Texas, and Tyler's in the middle of it. So at one point, the world's richest man, a guy named H.L. Hunt, and the Hunt family, then went on to become one of the great petroleum families. In fact, the Kansas City Chiefs are owned by a member of the Hunt family.
Do you know that, Scott? He's a big NFL guy.
Yeah, I did.
Did you know that? Wow.
So the Hunt family had a large presence in Tyler, and I believe it's a logical inference that Sandra was looking for a young fella from one of these Tyler, Texas oil families. Now, she eventually got one. Bobby Bridewell, from whom she took her surname that she stuck with over the years, he came from a Tyler, Texas oil family. Now, by the time she met him, he had gotten out of the oil business. He didn't follow his father's footsteps, and he'd become a hotel developer. So when she met him, he was a developer of luxury hotels. Now, there's a connection with the Hunt family. He had this idea to take an old mansion that was built in Dallas in I believe, around 1920. The guy who built it was a man named Shepard King, who'd made a fortune in the cotton business. And we say in Texas, before oil, cotton was king, and which is kind of cool because his name was Shepard King.
Yeah.
So the king of the king. Bobby had this idea in 1979. By then, the old Shepard King mansion had become dilapidated. No one really cared about it. He said, I'm going to take that old mansion, which is this beautiful Italian architecture. I mean, King brought in masons from Italy to build it, and I'm going to convert it into a luxury hotel. The lady who invested in this was one of H.L. Hunt's daughters.
Wow.
Yeah. Her name is Caroline Rose Hunt. The mansion on Turtle Creek, which Bobby developed, was the first property in the Rosewood Hotel portfolio, which anyone who is familiar with the world of luxury hotels, Rosewood is one of the great properties. The mansion on Turtle Creek was Rosewood's first property, and it was developed by Bobby Bridewell.
Holy heck.
Yeah.
It puts a lot together into one, huh? Yeah. So then she kind of gets what she wants there, right? So she's looking for a sugar daddy, whatever you want to call it back then.
Well, but remember, we're jumping ahead because, I jumped ahead to Bobby Bridewell. She married him in 1978. But before she married Bobby, when she was still a girl in her 20s, she married a man named David Steagle, who was a very studious, scholarly young man from Fort Worth, which is kind of our neighboring city. David studied a special discipline in dentistry called reconstructive dentistry, which is this sort of painstaking process of mapping out your teeth and then making crowns to make your jaw and your teeth perfect. And he really studied that. He wanted to build a big clientele in our community. I should mention the name of our community. It's in the middle of Dallas County. It's twin cities. They are independent townships in the middle of Dallas County. It's called Highland Park and University Park. And it is an affluent, independent township in the middle of Dallas County. David Steagle aspired to be the dentist of this affluent community, and he seemed destined to do it. Sandra met him when he was a young man on the make. She married him. They quickly had 3 children. But then something happened along the way for David Steagle. He became very, very stressed out. And his neighbors and his friends and his colleagues recognized what it was. His young wife could not control her spending. She aspired to be a society grande dame. They bought a very nice little house, and she hired the same interior designer of the great oil man Clint Murkison, who owned the Dallas Cowboys, Ross Perot, who was one of the great industrial guys of Dallas.
Guys that are extremely loaded.
Extremely
way beyond dentist salary.
Right. So this guy is, in his dental chair working day and night.
24, 25 hours a day, right?
And she's got this Yale-educated interior designer who's kind of flitting around Europe buying antiques and rugs and silver sets and armoires and original oil paintings. So David Steagle was driven to the poorhouse.
Did he have to borrow from his father too?
He borrowed $100K from his dad to pay off an IRS lien. Okay, the Internal Revenue Service is breathing down his neck. Okay, so this is an important part of the story because by all appearances, the guy's genuinely stressed out. So when he turns up shot to death in his marital bed, people thought, well, after all, he was stressed out. I mean, he had the IRS breathing down his neck. Maybe you would kill yourself too. And she said, well, we were estranged. I was sleeping in another room in the house. Implied in that is she didn't hear the gunshot. If you look at the incident report, the time of death is noted between 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. She said, I walked into the master bedroom at 7 a.m. to say hello, and I saw him lying in a pool of blood.
What kind of gun was used?
A .22 caliber target pistol.
She must sleep deep, huh? I mean, that's a deep sleeper. I wish I could sleep just 2% of her.
Yeah, so that's an interesting element of this. The year, well, it's 49 years ago to this day. It was February 22nd, 1975. Okay.
Phew, isn't that funny?
Okay. So cops come, guy's lying in bed, take a look at it. I can say they weren't looking too closely. I can give that away. But it kind of looks like the guy shot himself. Pretty young woman wearing a pretty yellow dress, very upset. Oh, my goodness, what's happened? I looked in and I saw him lying in a pool. I don't know, this is terrible. There isn't really an investigation conducted with this. I mean, I would say within 2 or 3 days, kind of looks like a suicide. She said he was stressed out. Other people said the guy was stressed. Looks like the guy shot himself. Suicide. Done. Okay. So that's 1975.
Right. And let's tell the audience, in 1975, there isn't technology like there is now. Back then, if a woman is distraught and so upset, it's unlikely that, correct me if I'm wrong, that at that time they're going to really dig into her for that at that time period in the 60s. She's upset. He was stressed out. So with that one, would you say it's not really uncommon for what took place there at that time?
It's a very good question. And I think your question goes to the heart of the sensibility of the Dallas police and the Dallas County District Attorney's office at the time. So the Dallas County District Attorney at the time was a guy named Henry Wade. Roe v. Wade.
Oh boy.
It's named after him.
Is it
now Henry Wade actually didn't care about reproduction. He had no interest in this. It was I think it was a fluke that this thing got going in his jurisdiction. In fact, I knew a assistant prosecutor who, after the Roe v. Wade, said, "Well, Mr. Wade, you know, it's quite a thing to have this landmark case named after you." He said, "I don't care about any of that stuff."
Isn't that wild?
It's kind of funny.
Who they named her after, he could care less what. He probably doesn't even want his name. He's like, please, just let this, get me away from this.
Now, the one thing that Henry Wade was real serious about, though, is violent crime. But in Dallas, Texas in the 1970s, violent crime was not perceived to be something that happened in my community. You know, my community, first of all, there's a perception of restraint and discretion, and it's keeping up with the Joneses, it's the country club membership, it's Neiman Marcus, it's this kind of trappings of respectability. And so there were almost never any violent deaths. I mean, it was extremely rare. Even suicide was extremely rare in my community. So if a guy in my community turned up shot, the perception was immediately, you know, people of this social class don't kill each other. The poor guy must have just been really upset. Violent crime was perceived to be stuff that happened in poor neighborhoods. Dallas was somewhat of a segregated city at the time, so there was a racial perception of violent crime. This is something that you're more likely to find in South Dallas, maybe African-American gangs. There were Jamaican gangs that were coming in at the time. That was the focus. In a case like this, it's just like, oh, you know, nice family, nice girl.
That's right. 3 kids, right?
He's just stressed out.
Just stressed out.
Yeah.
Couldn't handle it anymore. IRS after him. Had to borrow from dad. And that's a big hit in the 60s. I mean, in the 80s, it was a big hit if you had to go to your dad and ask for money when you're older, you know. Okay, you know, done.
So they didn't look at it very closely. Now, I can't say that I fault the Dallas police or the medical examiner for not looking too closely. I don't think their minds were primed to look. However, we'll get into this later. A careful examination of the death scene should have prompted them to ask more questions. Like, that's a little strange. There are strange elements that are on display in the crime scene, and you can see them in the crime scene photos, but that's getting ahead of things. Sandra collects $160,000 of life insurance death benefit, and she collects the entire estate.
The entire estate.
Yeah. So the house, for all the furniture and art and all of that, she gets all of it. The father who had paid off the IRS lien, she told him, if you want to see your grandkids, you won't press that claim.
I couldn't believe it.
So she did pretty well when her husband, David Steagle, husband number 1, apparently shot himself. She then has a period in the mid to late 70s of pretty frenetic dating. And her most interesting date in 1976.
Pull up the book on Amazon. It is so good. It really is.
Her most interesting date in the year 1976 was a guy named Norm Brinker. And he was a great restaurateur. He started several chain restaurants. I think Norm Brinker's largely given credit for starting the casual, what's it called? Casual sit down. Like, in other words, it's not fast food. The family actually goes and sits down but it's relatively affordable. So
right. Like Applebee's.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So Norm Brinker, that was really his concept. There was Steak and Ale was his first big casual dining chain. But you would go and sit down and eat a steak. I mean, it wasn't like McDonald's or something. And then Chili's, I think TGI Fridays. I mean, there were several of these things. So he kind of had the Midas touch with this restaurant concept. And he was a very prominent guy in Dallas. He was an Olympic equestrian, I believe, in the 1952 Olympics. And very handsome man. He started an equestrian club in Dallas called the Willow Bend Equestrian and Hunt Club. And so Norm was.
I bet that did well, very well.
Well,
right?
it was just kind of a society scene, polo and hunter jumpers, and so Norm was kind of a prominent man about town. So Sandra briefly dated him. He was in the midst of a somewhat acrimonious divorce with his wife, and we don't know exactly what happened. Like, something really went amiss in his divorce proceedings. The file, which should be in the civil court archives of his divorce, it went missing. So, like, that's public record, but it was somehow just went missing from the archive. So there seems to be something about Norm's divorce from his wife at the time he was dating Sandra that he didn't want the world to know about.
So he made sure that just happened to get feet and walk away. Which, I think all of us have been in that situation before where we wish we could just get one of those things to walk away,
Well, it kind of looks that way.
Yeah.
She thought she was going to land this big fish, but it didn't work out. So that's kind of an interesting society chapter in the book, her brief relationship with Norm Brinker. In 1978, she finally found her Prince Charming. And it is a charming part of the story because Bobby Bridewell, this is no exaggeration, he was the most popular man in Dallas society. Everybody loved Bobby.
Why did they love him so much?
Well, he was this guy that you just couldn't help having a blast with
Like
whenever
that
you
stigma where he's a magnet.
Well, I mean, so he comes from this Tyler, Texas oil family. I don't think he had a lot of money, but he had some money. He went to Washington and Lee University, where he was the head of the dance club. He was a great dancer. He loved formal parties, debutante balls, and he was always just the life of the party. He was also interested in racehorses. He actually collected racehorses.
Collected racehorses?
He did. And he had a company plane that he flew around, and it was apparently when you were with Bobby, he was larger than life. It was always just so much fun. We're all going to the racetrack and drinking mint juleps, and we're all going to get drunk and
have a blast
and bet a ton of money and
not a worry in the world
and
let's just
lose
have
it,
fun.
and who cares?
Yeah.
A couple of Bobby stories that I like. He just bought a new mare, female horse, a mare called Go-Go Dash, which I think is a great name. And he wanted to have all of his friends have the wildest mint julep party at the track in Arkansas. I think it's called Oak Lawn or Oak Springs. I can't remember. Anyway, a big racetrack in Arkansas. So he invites all of his friends. They all road trip or fly in on private planes. They have this big party at the track. And a friend of his who told me the story couldn't make it. He got hung up on some kind of business thing. So he calls Bobby and he says, how did Go-Go Dash do? And he said, I have never been so proud of any animal or human in my entire life. The little girl ran around the final turn, mud kicking in her face, and she beat the favored horse by, a whole neck or whatever.
Yeah.
And he says, well, congratulations, Bobby. That's awesome. How much did you win? He said, nothing. The favored horse came in third.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was fun to actually lose. Who cares? So he had this devil-may-care attitude that was infectious, and everybody loved him. Now, in the year 1977, he owned a a racehorse breeding operation and training operation, a thoroughbred racehorse farm, I guess you'd call it, just north of Dallas.
That's a ton of money. When you can breed those thoroughbreds.
Right. And he built a track, and I mean, it was a real thoroughbred
operation.
operation.
Yeah.
He came home one day, and the story is caught his wife, who is this Virginia belle, in flagrante delicto with the horse trainer. Yeah. And that was a bruise to his ego. He apparently adored this girl, and he kind of took it hard. For the first time in his life,
not so happy, lucky.
Like it was like, okay, I'm kind of having a hard time laughing this one off.
Yeah.
Sandra caught wind of this by multiple witness accounts that Bobby's marriage was on the rocks. She learned everything she could about thoroughbred horses, like
everything,
like every book, and she did, and I believe still probably does have a very good memory. And when she finally had this opportunity to meet him, she knew, I'm gonna ask him about his great passion, and boy, am I going to find this interesting.
Throws the hook, got him.
Right. So she finally does meet Bobby, and he's kind of in a vulnerable moment. His ego is just a bit bruised, and what happens is it's his 37th birthday, and a friend of his is going to have a wild birthday celebration, and they're going to try and cheer Bobby up.
Mr. Happy all the time.
Right.
Bet, have fun, have a good time.
Yeah.
We got to cheer Bobby up.
We're going to cheer Bobby up. And the way we're going to do it is there's this really cute girl named Sandra Steagle. She still went by her first husband's name. By all accounts, she's more fun than you can ever imagine, and beautiful to look at, and we'll invite her to the party, and we'll have her jump out of a cake.
Oh boy.
And so I've corroborated this. This is true.
Yeah.
So they bring in this huge cake. I don't know if you could buy these things for strip clubs or something. I
they
don't
got
know.
them there.
But anyway, boom, and then out comes this girl in a slinky dress, and it's Sandra. And he's delighted. And so very, very quickly he proposes marriage, and they marry, and they buy a house in Highland Park right down the street from my house, my family home.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was my first acquaintance with Sandra. She was my neighbor.
Holy moly.
Yeah.
Wow. That's it. She was literally your neighbor.
She lived, I say neighbor.
Well,
she
in
lived,
the same.
She lived probably 10 houses down. Yeah.
Wow.
So when I met Sandra, it was in the year 1983. Bobby, unfortunately, did not stick around long. So they married in 78. In 79, I think at the end of 79, beginning of 79, he was diagnosed with lymphoma. And so their marriage, the happy phase of their marriage was brief because he got sick. And by the time I started hanging around at Sandra's house, because I was friends with her daughter, Bobby had already died. So I didn't really know Sandra or Bobby. They bought a house down the street. I think I was vaguely aware that they were there. When I started hanging around in Sandra's house was a couple of years, or I should say 1 year after Bobby died. He died in 1982. I got to be friends with her daughter, Catherine, in 83. And I would go over and play with Catherine at her house, and occasionally Sandra would come sauntering through. And so I can't say that I got to know Sandra, but I definitely talked to her on a few occasions. And I think that's the thing that stuck with me all of these years. There was definitely something different about her from other mothers. I mean, no question about it. I mean, even at the time, I don't think I'm just remembering this in a distorted way. She had this kind of smoldering sensuality.
Aura,
She
like an aura
always
with her.
she always looked like $1,000,000. I mean, it didn't matter what time of day it was. She was always beautifully dressed, her fingernails, her lipstick, her hair, perfect. And she just had this kind of mesmerizing way. Like, if I talked to her about something, I mean, the most trivial 13-year-old boy stuff, she'd kind of hold me with this gaze. Like, whatever I was saying was really interesting.
Makes you feel like you're the most important person in the world at that time.
Correct.
And another thing, what she had done with him, while he's sick, she decides to remodel the house. I just think this is just shows how crazy this woman is. She throws him out of the house, right?
So remember, I don't know about this at the time. This only emerges later. So when I'm a 13-year-old boy, I don't know anything about this background, okay? And in those days, our parents didn't know where we were. I mean, we would leave in the morning to go play, and it was a very safe community, and we didn't come back till dinner. My mom didn't know where I was.
Did you have the street lights come in by the time the street lights?
Yeah. So Mom doesn't know that I'm hanging out at the Bridewell house. She doesn't know.
Yeah.
And during that time in the early 80s, my mother's mother, so my grandmother, was diagnosed with oral cancer. Okay. That really preoccupied my mom at the time. Now, I mention that because, like, not only is she looking after a sick parent and me and my 3 brothers, I mention it because the doctor who treated my grandmother was the same doctor who treated Bobby Bridewell from lymphoma. So that was another close connection that I have with the story. I actually, through my mother knew Bobby's doctor, and he plays an important role in this story. But again, that's jumping ahead. Suffice to say, when I was a boy in the years 1983 and 1984, I just thought Sandra is this sort of beautiful, kind of mysterious mom, not like other moms, like really kind of fascinating. It was only in the year 1987, so fast forward 3 years from this kind of adolescent fascination that I had with Sandra, that boom, Buddy sits down next to me in the high school cafeteria, flashes this D magazine cover, and it's her. It's Sandra, the mom down the street. It's like, what's going on here? He says, dude, you just have to read this thing. Like, her husbands keep getting taken out. And then there was a boy who was the class above us in high school. His mom had apparently gotten taken out by Sandra.
Phew.
So I start reading this, and it doesn't explicitly state that Sandra has murdered these 3 people. So her first husband, the wife of the cancer doctor who treated her second husband, who treated Bobby, and then her third husband. It doesn't come out and say that she did it, but the title of the article is The Black Widow, and it clearly insinuates that she did it. And when you're reading about these 3 gunshot deaths, one after the other, and I'm thinking to myself, well, no one gets shot in the head in this community. Like, no one, okay? In her case, it's 3 in a row. I mean, like how is it that these people keep getting shot in the head and she's their last known contact? I remember even as a 16-year-old boy thinking, that doesn't seem to be something we could attribute to coincidence.
And I go, if you're thinking that at 16, why aren't the officers or the investigators, why aren't they thinking that?
So here's where the whole story starts to take on all of these very strange twists. So her third husband lived with her in Dallas. For a while, he lived with her in their house down the street from me. Now, I didn't know him. That's an interesting part of the book. There's an interesting explication of why I never met her husband. There's a dramatic situation that happened. Sandra decided to sell their house on Lorraine Avenue down the street from me, and they bought a house in the neighboring town of University Park. It's just a couple of miles away, but it was a kind of a downgrade of their house. And that third husband who she moved to University Park with, they only are together as husband and wife for about 8 months or 9 months. They then separate. They're estranged. There's a question about putting some things in storage or getting something out of the storage facility where they apparently both kept their things. He then, at 4:55 p.m. on a Saturday evening, so it was Saturday, December the 7th, 1985, he's staying with a friend because he's estranged and separated from his wife. He runs out to run to the storage facility to do some kind of errand at the storage warehouse, tells his buddy, I'm just going to move some boxes or something. I'll be right back for dinner. Never comes back. Okay. He is then found shot to death in his car, but not in Dallas, in Oklahoma City. And he was originally from Oklahoma, from the Oklahoma City suburb of Edmond, Oklahoma. So the question was, why did he not go to the storage facility, or apparently not go to the storage facility or the warehouse? Why is he turning up dead, by the way, wearing the exact same clothing that he was wearing when he ran out the door to meet her? Why is he found 3 days later in his vehicle parked near the Oklahoma City airport, shot to death in his truck? Like, what happened between going to meet her at the warehouse and turning up in Oklahoma City? And so it's the Oklahoma City Police Department that gets the case. Now, they quickly ascertain, well, okay, the guy's from Oklahoma, but he lives in Dallas. He's a resident of Dallas, Texas. And they quickly realize he was last seen wearing the clothes that he was wearing when we found him. A huge cold front had moved in. He's wearing shorts and a light sweater. It was warm in Dallas on December. So it's like, this guy did not, like, he was shot a few days ago, apparently in Dallas. So they quickly realized, looks like this guy was shot in Dallas shortly after he ran out to meet his estranged wife, and someone then transported his vehicle with his body in it to Oklahoma City and dumped the vehicle and the body. They come to Dallas. It's a couple of Oklahoma City detectives. They don't know anything about Dallas. They don't know anything about this community. They don't have any contacts. The Dallas police are strangely uninterested in this.
Now, why do you think that? Why would they be uninterested in this? You got Oklahoma coming all the way to Dallas, and this isn't the first run-in with this woman that seems a little bit odd, and they have no interest? I mean, this is when the book is just like, holy shit.
This is when it gets weird, right?
Yeah.
It gets real weird here. And the Dallas cops were like, oh, have fun with that one. You know, the body was found in your jurisdiction. Good luck, boys. And I mean, I am not privy to the conversations that Oklahoma City detectives had with the Dallas police. I mean, maybe they kind of came in like they own the place and it's our case and we're going to easily solve it. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is they were on their own in Dallas. And they start asking around, and they quickly realize this young guy from Oklahoma who'd met this woman the day after he arrived in Dallas, this guy knew nothing about his wife. Like, he knew nothing about her, because they start asking around, and what they discover is this is the most notorious woman who's ever lived in this affluent community. And this young fella who winds up shot apparently was unaware of this. He didn't know what he'd gotten himself into.
I don't mean to go back to this, but this was a point in the book where I was like, what? So at that time period, was it like that with Dallas? You know, I know other states. If Pennsylvania goes to New York with the case, New York is like, oh, you want to come to New York and do your investigation? This is New York. You're on your own. Was it like that with Dallas?
Well, it shouldn't have been. I mean,
right, but that's how
I think in those days, I mean, and this is one of the conclusions of my book, law enforcement should have looked at all three of these cases, not as isolated cases, but should have viewed them together. And Dallas and Oklahoma City should have worked very, very closely together in evaluating these three cases. But as it turned out, Oklahoma City is examining the murder of the third husband, and there was no question that it was. One of the strangest things about this is they suspect her for very good reasons, and I go into this in the book. There are numerous reasons to suspect her. But this never prompts a reevaluation of the first husband and the doctor's wife, Betsy. Those cases should have been reexamined. They should have gone back. It's ultimately what the police didn't do in 1985, 86, when they were looking at the third husband. That's what I did.
You went back.
I went back and evaluated the first husband and the doctor's wife. The police at the time did not do that. Now,
what were the commonalities on the first two? What were the commonalities of the investigation? Like the first one, they didn't even go past just it's suicide.
Right. So the husband found at some point in our conversation, I do want to look at these crime scene photos with you. Actually, yeah, okay, no, you're good. So what y'all are about to play, it's a audio recording of the only press interview that Sandra ever gave to a small local, it's our community newspaper. It's called the Park Cities People.
It's the only one, huh?
It's interesting because the girl that conducted the interview, her name is Susan Albrecht, and she's mostly just doing little small town stuff. She actually did a great job of investigating this. So what happens is the Oklahoma City police come to Dallas to investigate this. And it's like, no, wait a minute. Like, this is the same woman whose first husband was found shot, and then the doctor's wife was found. So Susan's instincts, I need to talk to this woman. So she calls Sandra. And what you'll hear here is Sandra's response, her attitude to the Oklahoma City police investigation. So if you can play this.
Yeah.
City. A few months later, she gave the only press interview she ever would give to a reporter named Susan Albrecht at our local community newspaper, the Park Cities People.
Police aren't handling this at all, so no, they're not, and I don't know if you realize it or not, but the Oklahoma City Police have no jurisdiction or authority in Dallas. Right, I understand.
Note that she really seems to believe this assertion. I wondered if this erroneous belief explained why the culprit had taken the trouble to drive Alan's body to Oklahoma City after murdering him in Dallas. After making this weird statement, Sandra then makes another bizarre assertion.
Who's that mouse?
Everything has been done that could be done, and if anyone has seen the Broncos, he would have come forward at the time.
In other words, she believes the police should accept that they'll never detect the culprit and therefore cease their search for evidence and witnesses in Dallas.
I have nothing to do with this, and I don't know if that's been implied or not, but I do not have anything to do with this, and I don't appreciate that, and anyone that says that is setting themselves up for a libel suit.
A month after Sandra gave this interview,
That's it.
Alan
Okay, pause
Raren's
that.
mother, Gloria,
She has that very soft-spoken voice, too.
Yeah.
I just picked that up. That very soft, I'm so innocent. And if you come after me, I'm going to file on you. I didn't do anything. What is this all about?
Even though the Oklahoma City police and nor the reporter they're just saying, hey, we're just trying to figure out what happened to your husband. And I mean, the Oklahoma City police come to Dallas. They're like, we're we want to solve the murder of your husband. In that same interview, she says, I loved my husband. So then the question is then, well, if you loved him, why are you angry that the Oklahoma City police have come to Dallas to solve his case? And then I don't know if you, she says, I don't know if you know this, Oklahoma City police has no jurisdiction in Dallas. It's like, oh, is that why you transported his body to Oklahoma?
You did some research, honey. Right?
Yeah, well, it's not true, but she seems to believe that it is. And then the other thing she says is, I just think they should stop looking into this. I don't think that anyone is going, will have noticed him that night. So she says he never showed to the appointment. Okay, he never showed up. But at the same time, she's saying, I think the police need to just quit this. I don't think, had anyone seen him at the time, she says it, I think he would have come forward by now. Well, it's like you don't want the culprit in this to be found. You're in effect saying the police should give it up.
And almost threatening that if you do anything, I'm coming after you.
Even though no one said we think you did it.
Right. It's just, hey, ma'am, how are you? Just want to ask you a couple things, right? And right away, boom.
Correct. So that recording was kind of a find for me. I mean, I called Susan. By a miracle, she found this old Casio video recorder thing. Audio cassette recorder. And I was able to get it kind of cleaned up by a digital audio file guy. And there it is, the whole interview.
It's awesome. And when you read the book or you listen to the audio, you wonder, what does she really sound like? I really, because you just sent those earlier today. I was like, what does she really sound like in person? It's got to be that tone.
She has this soft kind of. It's not exactly a Texas accent either. Like if you were to hear my mom, who has a heavy Texas accent, if you were to compare my mom with Sandra has more of a southern, a little more of a southern accent.
I felt Alabama, maybe.
Yeah, right.
Little West Virginia.
Right. Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's what I felt. Yeah.
So anyway, this kind of Southern belle, which is very effective, by the way.
Yeah, she'll cook you a crock pot, John. She'll have dinner for you on the plate when you get home.
At least until you actually get married.
Just don't take a bite. Right? Yeah, she's gonna wait till the marriage because
and then the honeymoon
phase is over.
Ended quickly. Yeah.
So now where does she go from there?
Okay, so she becomes the prime suspect, and the Oklahoma City police, they come to Dallas repeatedly. They try and make their case. The Oklahoma County prosecutor, so Oklahoma City is within Oklahoma County. That's the name of the county. The district attorney is a guy named Bob Macy, who's kind of a gunslinging guy. He was well known for bringing murder charges, even with circumstantial evidence. Bob Macy tells the third husband, his name was Alan Rarick.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Bob Macy tells Alan's mom, she's a very important character in this. Her name's Gloria Rarick. Just the sweetest lady you've ever met, and has this enduring love for her child is one of the redemptive elements of this story. Bob Macy told Gloria, I'm going to indict this girl and we're going to take it to trial. And so that got Gloria's hopes up. A couple of months go by. She follows up at the DA's office and they say, well, we're turning this over to the FBI. And then, and the feds, they have all this jurisdiction. They can go anywhere they want. They can spend much time and resources as they want. They have all these forensic people. The feds look at it for a while in Dallas, but then nothing comes of that either. And the FBI file is very strange. It took me forever to get it.
I bet.
That's another story. But the whole thing just kind of runs into the sand, and the $220,000 death benefit, most of it is then paid out to Sandra.
And I wonder if that was all about territory. Because the FBI takes it over because you move a body or they suspect that a body was moved from Dallas to Oklahoma.
Yes, I mean that would be the most plausible explanation for why the feds got involved. But
There's no other reason, right?
Well, but when I finally got their case file, I mean, a heavily redacted. They put so much whiteout and pages. There's so many exceptions to the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, it's like, why have freedom of
Why
information
even have it?
if there's 10 million
Blackouts. Now they black
loopholes,
them out.
right? So, but what is evident is the feds suspected Sandra for multiple charges, weapons stuff, mail fraud, wire fraud. I mean, she was suspected by the feds of many, many things. Murder was just one thing they were looking at. But they too didn't do anything with it. They have a 1,300-page case file, but they didn't do anything with this.
That amazes me that the feds took the time to do that many pages of work, actually do that, and then not do anything.
They should have put a forensic psychologist from the behavioral sciences unit, which is their big unit for looking at what appear to be serial murders, and analyzed all of these cases. The feds did the same thing that the Oklahoma City police did. They just looked at the death of Alan Rehrig, the third husband, in isolation. They didn't go back and reevaluate the first husband and the doctor's wife.
Sorry for asking so many questions, but is that a routine back then? Was it normal for them not to go back on other cases?
Well, I mean, I suppose they could say they were following legal procedure, strictly by the letter. We will respect the medical examiner's scientific ruling.
Oh.
But what's weird about that, every time I would dig another layer into this thing, I would realize, but that's not true, because the medical examiner in 1982, when the doctor's wife was found shot, he stated in his own memo, I had a conversation with the deceased woman's husband, with the widower, and I told him, I can no more be certain of suicide on this than you can be certain of a clinical diagnosis. I mean, I could have gotten it wrong. The medical examiner states that in his own memo, clearly indicating he would be open to a reevaluation if someone wanted to bring him evidence of homicide. No one ever did.
That's mind-blowing. Think about that, Scott.
I know.
I mean, just it blows your mind. It blows your head off.
It's a very strange example of sort of the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. This department is not in contact with this department. No one is in a very assiduous, persistent way, like stick with it, look at all of the elements, bring it all together, evaluate it all together. Not just, I'm just staring at this murder here, or this suicide, or this appearance. No, look at all of these together. That's what the FBI, their forensic psychologists, do. But in this case, none of those guys were assigned to look at this.
It makes you, you would think, just from looking from the outside, that she was a celebrity, that she was in the political world, that she was somebody that knew somebody that was slipping payoffs, that was, turn the other way,
You do wonder about that. And one of the things that I discovered in my research was it wasn't an uncommon experience for me to get a tip to talk to a male witness, a man. I'm not sure if I want to talk too much about my experience with her,
Yeah.
It's kind of like,
you're like,
why don't you want to? And what you discover is, and this is documented. I mean, I'm not.
You're not just making this up.
Speculating.
It's not opinion.
On multiple occasions, Sandra got to know a married man, and this is a recurring theme in this book. And I just got to be friends with him, and I borrowed some money from him, or I got him to co-sign a loan, or he did some favors for me. And
was it ever I met a guy and just went to lunch? No.
So, and then, you know, things went south. We parted ways, and I never paid him back. And but he didn't press his case because he didn't want his wife to know about our friendship. And so you see this again and again, a married man who meets Sandra and develops some kind of a relationship. I won't speculate, but then later is not willing to provide any kind of witness testimony against her. So you come from an Italian background, you know, omerta.
Mm-hmm.
So omerta, I've seen nothing, hear nothing, say nothing.
Right. Hear nothing, say nothing, see nothing.
See nothing.
Yeah.
Okay. In Sandra's case, it's the omerta of
death.
No, the omerta of I mean, can I
say it?
The omerta of sex.
Yeah. Well, to me, if you're married and you get caught cheating, you're going to be paying a lot of alimony, a lot of child support. So that's death to me, just like it's death with a gun.
So that's the calculation.
Right. Yeah. And that's a smart calculation by her.
So you could be out 30 grand, 50 grand, 80 grand, or you could lose half your fortune pursuant to community property, family law. And it was an easy decision for most of these guys to make. Now, where the whole thing gets really dark is it's, you know, we ain't talking about 70 grand or something like that. Now, granted, this is 70 grand in 1980s dollars, so it's actually pretty much money.
What do you think that would be today?
I think $70,000 in the year 1980 is somewhere around 400K now. Maybe.
You agree with that, Scott? You were around back then.
Something like that.
Maybe 5.
Yeah.
I think 20 grand in 1985 is about 70 grand now. So yeah.
Yeah.
Where the whole thing gets weird is Sandra, and this is a element of this story that you see then becomes a major theme. Already when she was married to Bobby Bridewell, they were members of the Highland Park Presbyterian Church, which is a very affluent, socially prominent church congregation in Dallas. It's probably the richest church congregation in Dallas. Very affluent, socially ambitious people are members of this. Not only socially ambitious, socially established people are members of this. And Sandra repeatedly uses that church as an alibi. And there's a moment in this story where it became apparent to me that there's a pastor at the Highland Park Presbyterian Church who, by his own admission in my initial conversation, he told me, I think I know something of forensic value. I think I know something that would be useful to the police. And I say, well, there's no limitations on the prosecution of murder. So if you know something that could solve this case, I would be extremely grateful. And Gloria Rarig, the mother of the third husband, and we're talking about his murder, we would be very grateful if you would share that information with us. Well, let me think about it. So he thought about it, and then he never got back to me. That's a church pastor.
Upstairs didn't tell him?
So
knock.
I had that experience several times where what appeared to be a potentially valuable witness fell silent.
And that could also be why the FBI had problems, Dallas had problems, even, unrelated on the different ones. If these guys are so scared of her, and women, either or, that could be why it just kept being dead end, because you can have, especially then, correct? you can have a lot of evidence, but if you don't have that nail in the coffin or that strong witness, you know, what do you have a case?
Well, what I began to realize was that with the third husband, it would have to be a circumstantial case.
Yep.
It would have to be the totality of circumstances. It would have to be all of the elements together, okay, like a mosaic of all of these circumstances. You would present that to a jury. The totality of circumstances, I believe, would persuade a jury of her participation in this, culpable in some way. Now, she might have had an accomplice. The FBI and the Oklahoma City police indicate they believe she had an accomplice, at least someone who helped her to transport the body in the vehicle.
I have a question about that. You said the totality. They have to look at the totality.
Yeah, every element of it.
If she went into court, would the judge allow previous cases?
Well, they would have to all be charged.
Okay, yeah, because I don't see a trial where the judge would allow all that information.
You would have to bring charges against her for all of these, which means, and you've gotten to the essence of the story, right. You're going to have to go back and look at that first husband.
Yep.
You'll have to look at that doctor's wife. And you're going to have to carefully ascertain, were these really suicides?
Unbelievable.
So my community, starting with the D Magazine, the famous D Magazine cover story of May 1987.
And that would be equivalent now to Instagram, TikTok,
I mean,
Wall Street Journal.
Remember in those days, we didn't have the internet. So a big, juicy local story involving seduction and apparent murder. I mean, that D Magazine, to give you an idea, D Magazine was very popular. People in Dallas, people in Texas like to read about Dallas and Texas. I mean, the Cowboys, the Neiman Marcus, the whole thing. That 1987 feature on this story, to this day, remains the most, well, finally the electronic version was put online. It remains the most read D Magazine story of all time by a very large, like multiples. Okay. So that story absolutely riveted our community. But no one said, hey, let's go back and, it looks like she, by all appearances, the police suspect her of murdering her, and it looks awfully suspicious. No one said, okay, if she, apparently, we don't know, but it kind of looks like she did. And then the circumstances were strikingly similar. Okay. Husband runs out to meet her. The doctor's wife is running an errand with her. The commonalities start to stack up. No one, until I came along, seriously examined those first two violent deaths, which were ruled suicide. So that was the heart of my research, was examining those first two. I went through a lot of trouble to get the Dallas police photographs of the first husband as he was found, and then Betsy Bagwell, the doctor's wife, as she was found in her vehicle. And I had those photos analyzed. So
and did you have to do all that through the Freedom of Information Act?
No, it's the Open Records Act. So there's the Freedom of Information Act, which pertains to national agencies. And then when they passed, when Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act, I think most states followed Congress's lead, and they passed State Open Records Act. So I was able to obtain those photographs pursuant to the State of Texas Open Records Act.
Congratulations.
It wasn't easy.
I bet you 9 out of 10 they go, yeah, right, I'm not doing this. Trash.
Right.
Right.
And then in the case of the first husband, my initial file request, the response is, well, we don't have anything, like just nothing. And I realized you have to know precisely what to ask for. It can't be, a general, hey, give me what you got on David Lawrence Steagle, who died on February 22nd, 1970. No. You have to specifically, it's almost like you have to know what records there are in order to ask for them. So it was once I started narrowing some very specific requests that I started getting some of this stuff. And those death scene photos of David were very revealing. When evaluated by modern standards, when you're alert and awake to what you should be looking for, same with Betsy Bagwell. So that was the heart of my research, was really going back and looking at those earlier cases.
And when you got a chance to look at the photos, have them looked at by other professionals, what was the outcome versus the outcome that was stated in the report?
Well, I concluded, with consultation from a internationally renowned bloodstain pattern analyst and from a former FBI forensic psychologist. Oof. So I'm sorry to toot my horn, but I'm doing the work that law enforcement didn't do in the day. And the conclusion that I draw in consultation with professionals is that these were not suicides. They were homicides. And there's no explanation for who else could have done it. By Sandra's own admission, she was in the house with her husband that night. There's no one else in the house.
I just don't get how a cold case guy would not jump on top of this and just rip it apart.
No one thought to really dive into it and look at it.
Well, maybe this will. Maybe this will change things.
Well, I think it should. I think that the Dallas County prosecutor, I believe, or district attorney's office, should reopen these cases. I mean, the medical examiner in 1982 with Betsy Bagwell, he said in his own case file, I can't be sure that this is a suicide. He stated he would be open to reevaluating it. So I'm just quoting the Dallas County medical examiner back then. Well, you want to take a look at those two cases?
Yeah.
Or do you? Before we do that, that's kind of climactic.
Yeah.
Do you have any other questions?
It just rattled my head that she kept getting away with this over and over again. And if you take times like today, if I'm married and my wife dies and 3 months later or less, I take the insurance money, and 2 years later, I'm with another woman, together with them, and suddenly that person within 3-4 years disappears. I mean, there is no ifs, ands, or buts. I mean, I'm going to be investigated with a toothpick.
Part of that is law enforcement has become more sophisticated. That's one thing. Information sharing has become far more efficient, and all these electronic files. Remember, in those days, everything were hard copies, and you'd have to go grubbing around in an archive.
Such work to get anything.
Now it's far more digital automation of information sharing. And thirdly, you're a man. And I think that to this day, the perception of violent crime is that it's mostly committed by men. One theory is that it's a myth that the majority or a large majority of serial killers are male. It's a theory is that there are many female serial detectors. They're just undetected.
That's what I was going to say. My other question was, and not being sexist at all, it's just that especially in the 60s, 70s, and prior, a woman to do that, I mean, how likely is that? Even if you do have 3 off-the-wall circumstances, you have this tiny little woman with the soft voice that sounds like she's from West Virginia. Women don't do that. They raise the kid, they cook, they clean, they do this, they do that. They're not killing anybody. So that's the only conclusion when reading through this, more than once, by the way, because I went back. I said, okay, is it because she's a girl? Was somebody paid off? Was it just too much work?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting idea that you have, and I think it's a widely shared and perceived idea. The irony of all of this, and it's interesting how and I guess what's happening in the late 60s is the rise of feminism, I guess. And so the idea of the femme fatale that you see in film noir, I mean, you go back to the 40s and 50s, and this idea of the seductive femme fatale who seduces the guy and then gets him to do her bidding, even if it's committing murder, and collecting the life insurance. There are a lot of movies in the 40s and 50s in which this is the dramatic situation. My personal favorite is Double Indemnity, Billy Wilder's 1944 film with Fred McMurray and Barbara Stanwyck.
I'm going to watch that.
Oh, it's great. I mean, Billy Wilder was such a master. Somebody told me, go back and watch that movie really closely. The amount of just fine symbolism and like every second of that film, nothing is left to chance. It's just a masterpiece. And then I think it was in 1982, I think it was Brian De Palma who made a remake of Double Indemnity. Was it Brian De Palma? I'm suddenly forgetting the director. It's called Body Heat.
Body Heat?
With Kathleen Turner
and
William Hurt. And I sometimes I think I like Body Heat. It's definitely a remake of Double Indemnity. It may even be better. And Kathleen Turner.
That's why I was like, I'm going to watch that one, I think.
I mean, if you told me that woman's going to kill you, I would have said fine.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't matter. It's great.
At least I could go out like this, right?
And that's basically the attitude of the man. Like, what's cool about Body Heat is he begins to realize this is a dangerous game I'm playing. Like, I don't really know this girl, but that almost makes it even more sexually exciting.
Seductive, right?
That she's possibly dangerous. Yeah. And there's a scene where he's a lawyer, and he has a couple of buddies, and they're beginning to think, there's something weird going on with you right now. And there's a wonderful moment where he says, I suppose there is something weird going on with me right now, but I don't care. He actually says that.
And something you just said, in the 40s and 50s, there was a lot of movies like this, right? That basically depicted her. So what I found is most movies, there's some truth based to them all. Because where do they come up with it? Just one situation? And what else you said is that there's a lot of women serial killers. They just don't get caught. But the perception is that they're all men. So go back to the movies that were made. A lot of women taking out men, robbing them to death. Well, there's got to be truth to that somewhere. So it was going on a lot then for them to make a movie of it. That's just what my opinion. That's not factual. It's just
no. I mean, I think there are documented cases in history of women who would only later, because oftentimes they were moving around from state to state, and there wasn't very good communication between state law enforcement. Somebody would look up one day and say, who is this woman, like, whose husband died under mysterious circumstances? I'm going back in time. And someone, whether it be an insurance investigator, someone would start looking at this and, like, doing some old-fashioned gumshoe detective work, and would discover, oh my goodness, like this is like the fifth time this woman has been married and claimed a life insurance benefit. So there are cases documented in history of this, and I can only guess that's where these film noir
have to be
girls come from.
And then the only other thing, and then we'll start on the other, is that maybe they were just scared, because even now, might be worse now, but for sure I think then If you go and convict a woman of 5, 6, 7 murders, crazy ones, maybe they were scared to be the one to stand up on that podium and say, hey, today we're indicting Sandra of A, B, C, D. Oh, you're a sexist. Women aren't like that. You know, my wife's a woman, blah, blah, blah. And maybe they didn't want to deal with that criticism.
I mean, the gender politics and all of that, I mean, I suppose we all have to contend with that all the time. Now, the interesting thing about my book, so should anybody come to me and say, the way you've developed this character is, you know, somehow patriarchal, male, you know, sexist, whatever. What I can say is that in this story, men are completely ineffectual. They just can't seem to pull anything together in terms of taking responsibility in their relationships with this woman. The only people, and there are at least 5 of them, who really found some backbone and stood up and pursued justice were women.
Mm-hmm.
The good guys in this are all, without exception, females. They're the ones that stood up to Sandra. So I'm just telling the story. And Sandra finally, not for murder, but for identity theft and fraud, the law finally got to her, and that's her mugshot. You see, she's quite a bit older.
Yeah.
Here she is well, she told this guy that she was 36.
Right.
In fact,
right.
in fact, at the time that was taken, she was 40. But still,
She's pretty.
Very pretty 40-year-old girl. Here she is 22 years later, when she was arrested in Brunswick County, North Carolina. She had posed as a Christian minister and missionary, moved in with an elderly lady, a widow, said, I'm in between missions abroad. I'm about to do a mission in Africa, but I'm not yet departing. And I'd be happy to look after you, help around the house, shop, cook, you know, run errands for you. Moved in with this elderly widow.
Who was 77, correct?
77. And stole her identity, got her social security number, took out credit cards in her name, attempted to have her social security benefit rerouted. That's what got the Social Security Administration onto her. The law enforcement agent who really made the case, who really pursued this and wouldn't let it go, was a female sheriff's deputy in Brunswick County. And Jane Todd is her name. It was the efforts of Jane, a woman, that ultimately prevailed and ultimately secured a conviction. Sandra got 2 years for aggravated identity theft. It's kind of a clerical sounding. It's actually it's actually serious felony. It just sounds kind of weak.
Like nothing. Compare, you know, as we're talking here, it's like, what? You got what? You know.
But it would be like, so identity theft is what would enable me to pretend to be someone else in order to access bank accounts, to take out loans, there's all kinds of financial fraud that you can commit if you succeed in stealing someone's identity. Now, I guess what was aggravated about this was, it's one thing to do it to a stranger. You know, you steal someone's credit card and you pretend to be that person. What was perfidious about Sandra's conduct in this case, first of all, she pretended to be a woman of God, a minister and a missionary, which touched the heart of her victim. The second thing is she feigned love and affection. She assured this old lady, I really care about you. I want what's best for you. I love you. So it's that, you know, in Dante's Inferno, the lowest circle, the 9th circle, is occupied by people who gain trust by feigning a bond of affection and personal friendship, and then betrayal of a trust. So that's what it looked like with this lady. Her name was Sue Mosley. And of course, the question that Jane Todd asked was, what was the end game for Sue? She had an estate. She had a house that I think was appraised at about $2.8 million. What was the end game with Sue? I mean, in other words, had law enforcement not gotten onto Sandra's trail at this point and arrested her, what would have happened to Sue? So thankfully for Sue, we didn't find out. She was arrested. She pled out to aggravated identity. I think there were 17 fraud charges. They were dropped in exchange for pleading to aggravated identity theft. She did 2 years in a federal pen. Interestingly enough, same pen in which Martha Stewart did some time.
No, she was at a camp. Yeah, they want to call it a pen. No, she was in a camp. You just walk around with no fence. It's a cakewalk.
Now, when Sandra was in pretrial detention, I went and visited her. And that was a weird experience.
How was that? Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, I was just getting started in my career. I mean, I'd written one book, but I didn't have that much experience interviewing a subject. That is, a subject under suspicion.
Good one to start with there, John.
So, I went in with the memory of her looking like that.
Right.
That was my recollection of her. Okay, so the first thing that was a little bit weird, and this isn't, we all age, so yeah. I'm not picking on Sandra for aging. I'm just saying that was my recollection of her. I go into the Edgecombe County Jail where she was being detained, and the arrest was in Brunswick. She was then remanded to a federal facility in Raleigh, Durham, but they didn't have enough room. Like the female facility was full. So then they stuck her in the Edgecombe County Jail just for pretrial detention. That's where I visited her. And they said, okay, I signed in. I said, I want to visit the detainee, Sandra Bridewell. And they said, okay. And they led me to this partition. So, I step into her field of view and I'm seeing her for the first time in 24 years. I say, hello, Sandra. And I'm probably looking naive and like I don't know what I'm doing and probably nervous. Do you remember me? And she says, well, I'm sorry that I don't. I mean, like this demure, I would have loved to have remembered you, but I just don't. And I said, I'm John Leake. I'm Sam and Kathy's son. I grew up down the street. I was friends with your daughter, Catherine. And then I'm sorry, I don't remember you.
Still doing it.
And so, it was kind of fun. I mean, maybe she didn't remember me. I was just some dumbass kid. Maybe she didn't. Fair enough. But then I asked what I thought was a pretty intelligent question. I said, I'm here to hear your side of the story. Like, you've never told it before.
Good way to word it. So it's not attacking.
Right.
Yeah.
And I said, you can tell me anything you want. I'll just listen. And she said, I don't have anything to say. God is my witness and vindicator, and that's good enough for me. And I said, well, you're leaving me only with the other side that I've heard. And she immediately, it was good. It was good.
Move, John.
She said,
good move, buddy.
She said the gossip and slander of hypocrites.
Oh boy.
Which I thought was pretty good.
She's quick.
Yeah, the gossip and slander of hypocrites who've hurt me and my family.
Huh.
And it just went nowhere. She just, like, whatever chess move.
Spun.
And I just realized she's a hell of a lot smarter than I am. I mean, it was kind of like, I better just give up right now. And I said, well, does this mean that the truth will come out, the truth of these latest controversies here in North Carolina. Will that come out at trial? And she said, that's for my attorney to figure out. I have very good counsel. And at that point, it was clear, I'm not going to talk to you.
Yeah.
Now, a quick footnote to that's kind of fun. The next day, I attended a custody hearing. Okay, so she's in pretrial detention, but there is a kind of a backwoods evangelical minister who's got a children's charity, at least he claims that he does. I mean, I guess he did, called Operation Feed a Child. And he's what you would expect of a southern kind of backwoods, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, real evangelical, Bible guy. And for some reason, he's decided he wants to get Sandra out of pretrial. He wants her to stay with him and his wife, he was a married man, and to work, to stay on his property and to work for his charity pending her trial. So he couldn't, because he himself had a felony conviction. He got his wife.
I'm sorry.
He got his wife to file the petition to take Sandra into their custody pending trial. And that was a very weird custody hearing.
Maybe he thought, well, she likes to kill for money, hypothetically. What better to have on my team?
I don't know what he was thinking, quite frankly. I mean,
or what did she have on him?
I don't know. His name was Pastor Lee Younce, and he may be still alive. Maybe you'll hear this. Hello, Lee. I actually remember you, and I suspect he remembers me, because after the hearing, so this cocky federal judge says, this is the motion is ridiculous on the face of it. The petitioner, has no control whatsoever over the defendant. I mean, this is just ridiculous. Motion denied. Almost dismissive, almost in a flippant way. I thought this federal judge, the federal prosecutor is the one that makes this flippant. This is ridiculous. The court shouldn't even consider this. And then the judge agrees with the prosecutor.
And again, the prosecutor saying this,
right,
of the feds.
Right. Like this is
wow.
The petition is on the face of it ridiculous.
That never happens ever.
So well, I mean, they're acting cocky. Like, we have a case. Like, we're going to take this girl to trial. We think that she's manipulative and deceptive. This woman that's petitioning for her, to have her and take her in. This is ridiculous. So, motion denied. The defendant will go back into, incarceration. So after that, I approached the pastor. And I say, Pastor Younce, may I have a word with you?
Oh, boy.
And he just says, no, and walks to
he's a pastor. What do you mean no?
He doesn't have anything to say to me, okay?
Wow.
So I follow him to the elevator. The courtroom is on the second floor of this federal building. And I don't have the guts to get on. This guy's kind of scary. He had this kind of aggressive energy about him. I was like, I don't want to be on the elevator with this dude. He looks at me right as the elevator doors are about to close, and he realizes who I am. And he sticks his hand out. It actually blocks the closing doors of the elevator. They jolt back open. He says, John Leake, son of Sam and Kathy Leake, grew up on 4421 Lorraine Avenue.
Now, that moment, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking, this guy's
gonna kill you,
scary,
and
he's letting me know who I am. And Sandra clearly filed away in that pretty little head of hers who I really am. And he says, you presented yourself to Camille. He actually continued to refer to her by the alias that she was using. You presented yourself to Camille under false pretenses. You said that you were a family, friend and neighbor from, back in the day, when in fact you're an author. And I said, well, I'm both. I'm a family friend and neighbor from the day, and I'm an author. I've come here to hear Camille's side of this.
How crazy is that to you that he's calling her Camille?
He just went
You
with
know?
her alias. She's had about 13 aliases over the years. So Camille was the name of her adopted mother. So when the D Magazine piece came out, when she moved to California, she started calling herself by her mother's name, her deceased mom's name. So I then go for a walk with Pastor Younts. And it's a a long story. I do recount it in my book. It's a very interesting spiritual moment in this of religion and God and forgiveness and the whole thing. It's pretty good. He's a pretty good character.
He is. When I read it, I kept thinking the people should read it and have their own opinion because they don't care what I think. But when you read this book or listen to this book, this woman is smart. She realizes she's getting older, can't really throw around the sexual as much. What better thing to go to than religion, the church? What is better than that?
It's true.
To pry on.
It's true. But Sandra retained her seductiveness as well, just with older men. So she was let out of jail. She did her time. She was released from jail in 2011. And I also recount this in the book. She makes her way to New England. She resurfaces in New England, not in a religious guise. She was getting older, but kind of could
pull off it.
Yeah, and still had this feminine charm. She actually went back to sort of her romantic persona in New England after she was released. So she could move back and forth in these different personae. It's very interesting.
If you don't mind, I'd like to bring up one more thing that I thought really was wild. So she had gotten a hysterectomy, right?
I have multiple witnesses who have told me that Sandra got a hysterectomy in the late 70s.
However, she ends up with another guy and acts like she's pregnant.
She claimed to be pregnant with multiple men. As old as the age of 67, she was claiming to be pregnant.
Yeah.
So I would say that is another recurring theme. You know, girl meets boy, they start getting into some kind of a paramour situation. Maybe he's married. And then she says, well, I'm pregnant. Now I have multiple witnesses who've told me that they had that experience. Yeah, I had a long conversation with a divorce attorney. And Dallas, interestingly enough, in the early 80s, was the divorce capital of the world.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
I think it was this romance and glamour of sort of keeping up with the Joneses of if you're a really pretty girl, or if suddenly you're a man and you come into your own with your career, and suddenly you begin to think there's more excitement to life than just being a married family man or a married family woman. I want to go. I'm in my late 30s. I want to go party. I mean, that attitude seems to have come on very strong in Dallas. And there's a paradox in this story. You see this constant tension between this late 70s, everybody's making a lot of money, and it's one of the only economies in the country in the 70s that was doing well, because with the Arab oil embargo in 1974, it spiked the price of oil. So suddenly in the 70s, which was a kind of depression, high interest rate, or recession, high interest rate thing in most of the Dallas, people are raking it in, or there's a lot of dough being injected into the city. So you see this temptation of money and clothes and glamour and partying and having fun. Cocaine came on very strong in Dallas in the late 70s. I think cocaine actually plays a role in this story. And then you have in the early 80s, it's like there's this moment where these people who have been subjected to so much temptation, perhaps they've even yielded, it's like they start trying to hang on to marriage and family, trying to hold it together. And one of the strategies that seemed to happen at this time in the early 80s was going to church. And suddenly you have this kind of renaissance of church going with people in their late 30s and early 40s. And I perceive that to be, okay, I don't want to get a divorce. Like I see how this winds up. You know, the guy ends up living in some dumpy apartment and his kids don't like him and it just kind of sucks. So this Presbyterian church that plays such a prominent role in this story, there you have this tension that's like, you know, at breaking point, you know, the temptation to all of this pleasure, and then, but they really want to hang on. And and so she's like working this conflict in the heart of every man, I suppose. The remark that you made earlier, and this is what the divorce attorney told me, you'd have a guy that made some money in banking, or maybe he was a lawyer, or maybe a doctor. Doctors were an interesting target. And they would be taken by surprise. It would be like, whoa, where did this woman come from? Like, you know, I've been kind of doing the 9-to-5 grind, going to the office, coming home, wife, kids, you know, trying to keep up with the Joneses, pay the bills, make the mortgage payment. And it's kind of boring,
content life, the same thing every day. Whatever lust was there in the beginning is gone because you're tired from the kids and you're tired from all the stress. And boom.
There she is.
There she is.
Would you like to look at these first two cases?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, let's start with the first husband.
Okay.
Style cottage. And on the morning of
My research was to re-examine those earlier deaths. And what I did was I obtained the original death scene photographs and had those evaluated by contemporary forensic experts trained in the most up-to-date methods of bloodstain pattern analysis, crime scene investigations, to get a second opinion about these photographs. What you just saw was the position in which David Steagle was found. There's a sequence of photographs. The first two in the police sequence, the cover was drawn up over his left hand lying on the weapon. So the police had to pull the cover back. Observe a few things here. I have a Gillette Track 2 razor in my right hand. I have the razor blade here on the sheet. This is how David Steagle was found. He has these 3 slashes on his arm. These are rather shallow cuts, these 2 here. This one here is deep. It's a deep wound. There's also a transfer stain right here, at this point here. Notice the hand placement here on the weapon. Okay, this is the exact same weapon, the Ruger Mark I target pistol. We know that David's right arm never moved at all. It's very clear from the bloodstain pattern. His right arm never moved. If we're arguing, as the medical examiner at the time claimed, that this was suicide, if it's suicide, it could only mean, because he only has his left hand to work with, we're making the proposition that he got into bed with a loaded, it's loaded and cocked, so he's prepared this weapon, loaded it, cocked it, in order to shoot himself, but he, a doctor with 1 year of anatomy at the Baylor School of Dentistry, takes as well this Gillette Track 2 razor in addition to the loaded weapon with him to bed. Before he shoots himself, he makes these 3 incisions. This is if we're arguing suicide. The first thing that I thought with respect to this is he knows that this is going to have no lethal effect. He knows from his anatomy training the radial artery is quite deep in this section of the arm. Where the radial artery comes up close is here where you take the pulse. He's had this training in medicine and dentistry. So if David wants to make the incision to lethal effect, he would start here at the radial artery. These 3 incisions had no lethal effect. The only thing that they would have done is cause pain and distress. So we're saying if it's suicide, he brought all of this to bed with him. He made these incisions. As he well knew, they didn't kill him. He didn't bleed out. So then he sets the razor blade down. Notice that there's no blood visible on the razor blade, and there's no blood visible on his thumb or his fingers. You will note that the wound in the middle is quite deep. So even if he's holding this in a very skilled, dexterous way, it's very hard for me to imagine that he wouldn't have gotten blood on the razor blade. There's also no blood on the sheet. Okay, so he's done this. It hasn't worked. Right arm never moves. You can see clearly from the bloodstain pattern. So it's not that he got frustrated and decided, oh dear, now I'm going to have to get out of bed and find that pistol. He's already brought the pistol with him. This is heavy. It weighs 2.2 pounds. The medical examiner found from the tattooing and gunshot pattern that this was not a contact wound. So I consulted with Dr. John Garavaglia. She found this the most suspicious of all. Statistically speaking, suicides, they almost always rest the barrel on the temple, not only because it's a lot more comfortable, but to have that surety of aim. According to the medical examiner, this was not a contact wound. It was a close-up wound of entrance, so no muzzle contact. Again, following the logic of suicide, he can't really be sure of his aim, but we're claiming that he held the pistol away from his temple for whatever reasons. Squeezes the trigger. The .22 caliber long rifle bullet goes clear through his head. It's found in a blood clot adhering to the pillow. There's an exit wound on the right side of his head. After firing the shot, he continues holding the weapon, places it here on the bed, removes his finger from the trigger guard, removes his hand from the grip, and then places his hand on the weapon here. And then, for mysterious reasons, we find that the cover is then drawn up over this. This is highly improbable. The instant the bullet shot through his brain, his left arm, suspending the pistol over his head, would have simply fallen, and his left hand would have released the gun. He wouldn't have continued grasping it and extended it almost an arm's length from his head. Now, the wounds on his arm, they are ante-mortem. So these were administered before he stopped breathing. However, we know from the blood droplets around his nose that he continued breathing for some time after the shot was fired. There are blood droplets that went into his nose and were ejected from his nose. It's very, very clear in the photos. So you had ante-mortem bleeding here on his arm, but we also know that he continued breathing after he was shot. These are all details that I examine in my book. The totality of all of these elements indicate that this was not a suicide. He's lying in bed in a comfortable sleeping position wearing his pajamas. when someone else fired the shot through his head.
The culprit then smoothed out the covers on the right side of the bed, tucked the comforter along the back side of his legs,
and staged it to look like a suicide.
So say he goes to do it, and he's not quite sure if he really wants to kill himself. So he goes up a little high. He went through an enemy, but he thinks maybe this will do it. I'm a little scared, so I'm just going to do it here and see if it does the job. It doesn't do the job, so he takes the gun, puts it up, bang. He's still breathing after we can see the splatter. So he could have maybe somehow pulled the cover over him because he's still breathing. Maybe he had some Superman strength to pull the cover. Let's just devil's advocate, adrenaline, whatever you want to say. But the tucking in behind him. So you're going to shoot yourself in the head. You're going to slice your wrist 2-3 times. And somehow you're going to be perfectly tucked in behind you and the bed cover flat. That's where I think it's dead. But the other devil's advocate, maybe you could play that if you don't want to do the paperwork.
Well, so this is an example of how it's the aggregate of all of these things. Okay, so the Dallas, first of all, the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office did a study on single gunshot wound suicides. Okay, and if I remember correctly, there were, I want to say 147 known, I say known. The police and the medical examiner concluded these were single gunshot wound to the head suicide. All of them were contact wounds. Okay. And there's a reason why for that. If you say, okay, I'm going to make myself comfortable in bed and I'm going to shoot myself in the head with a pistol. You can't, well, first of all, so if you're lying on your right-hand side, believe it or not, 2.5 pounds, you kind of have to cock your shoulder.
True.
And that weight is bearing down, okay? You can't really see where kind of, but not really. You don't know. So are you just going to lobotomize yourself? Are you going to blow your eyes
Blind
out?
yourself?
Blind yourself? If you rest it on your temple, then you know where the shot is going to be fired. So this non-contact wound for a self-inflicted guy lying in bed, it's statistically wildly anomalous. Okay. Now, I went through the trouble of talking about, so what you talked about is a hesitation cut.
Mm-hmm.
You oftentimes see this with people who don't really want to commit suicide. It's kind of a cry for help. Oftentimes you see this more with females than males. If he'd wanted to just do hesitation cuts, it was a cry for help from his wife or from his whoever, his colleagues, or why did he bring a loaded and cocked pistol to bed with him?
Why bring both, right?
I mean, if you're ready to end it, and there's statistical studies on suicide, men are less likely to make suicide attempts that don't work. And if they've decided to do it, they're statistically speaking far more likely to actually go through with it. So shooting yourself in the head is a way to be, men perceive this to be a way to be done. Like bang, and a millisecond, it's lights out and you're gone. Statistically speaking, and the fact that he's a medical doctor, he knew, and in fact, in the wound description in the medical examiner's external examination report, no major blood vessels were severed. He knew that wouldn't kill him. He knew those wounds would have no lethal effect, but they would be distressing. I mean, you say to yourself, I'm going to climb into bed with a loaded pistol. It's loaded and cocked. I mean, it's a semi-automatic, so you pull the slide back, it chambers the round, and it's cocked. So it's ready to go, okay? And then you say, okay, I've got the gun, but before I take my life, I'm going to go ahead and make this really miserable by cutting myself. Okay.
And then when that doesn't work and I'm sitting there bleeding.
I'm sitting there in pain and watching myself bleed, then I'll shoot myself. Okay, this isn't science. People do weird stuff. It's not likely, though. Now, the other thing that a former FBI guy, Greg McCrary is his name. He's a forensic psychologist. He was one of the early guys who developed the FBI's forensic psychology program back in the 80s. He made a couple of interesting observations. First of all, the cover's tucked in. The cover partly drawn up over the left hand on the weapon, and then the tuck in along the back legs. He's actually seen multiple cases of that. And in every instance, there was a pre-existing intimate relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. He said, "I've seen this multiple times." But the point is, and I hope that presentation wasn't too long. But there are all these different elements to this. If you're holding this at a distance, not resting it, but holding it right here, your shoulders kind of cocked back. You actually are having to exert some muscular, nervous coordination and strength. Bang, you would not expect the victim who's just fired the shot to continue holding the 2.2-pound pistol, extend, place on the bed, retract fingers from trigger guard and grip, and then, there's multiple
steps that took place.
Holding on, placing, retracting. You would expect the hand just to go bang, the bullet goes through the brain, the hand to go limp, and to drop the pistol. And again, the former FBI forensic psychologist who's looked at several self-inflicted gunshot wounds and homicides, in his experience, the hand just goes limp. You'll find the gun right next to the decedent. Maybe the decedent even falls on top of the gun, but this extending it, setting it down, extremely unlikely.
And now, not playing devil's advocate, it spells it out. The guy's a doctor. He knows exactly where to cut. If he wants to go out that way, he knows right where to do it.
It's where you take the patient's pulse.
Right. Take the patient's pulse. He knows where to do it. Then to have a gun and not put it to his head, you could put 10,000 guys in a room and every guy's going to say, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to put it right up to my head and I'm going to make sure lights out. I don't know one single guy that says, when I do it, I'm going to hold it like this. No, they're going to put it here because, like myself, I would think, if I'm going to do this, I don't want to be a vegetable. I don't want my usual bad luck to be bad luck this time. And I go to do this crazy thing, and now I'm alive, but I have a feeding tube, and now I can't even take myself out. You're gonna go all the way, especially if you're at that point.
The other thing is that the middle wound, although it didn't sever a major blood vessel, it did go down into the fascia, into the muscle. That razor blade does not appear to be the cutting tool that was used.
Right. How would that not even have a speck of dried blood on it?
Well, you can't, to play the devil's advocate.
Yeah.
In the photo, you can't see the back side of it. You can't see his entire fingers. You can see a lot of his fingers, but not the end. And then in terms of the bed sheet and all of that, but it's just notable as it's a notable absence. It's like I can't see any blood at all on the razor, the sheet, or the parts of his fingers that are visible. It's not proof, but again, it seems improbable. It's another improbability. So what you look at when you look at all of this is all of these things combined. Also combined with witness testimony of people who I interviewed just prior to David's death. The totality of all of this, the tucked in sheets, the lack of blood on the razor. It's not a contact wound, and contradiction to huge statistical analyses of this. What you're left with is the final conclusion is this wasn't a suicide. This was a homicide staged to look like a suicide. That's what I believe. I mean, I'd love to see a prosecutor put it in front of a jury and let a jury decide.
I mean, this would be a 2-day trial. You know what I mean?
Well, I think,
especially stacked, like you keep saying. You know, if you take one, like we just looked at one, sure, you
maybe
can.
it's a fluke. Yeah.
Maybe it's a fluke. But when you got 3, 4, well, you know, the list goes on, and they're all these crazy things. Like when I believe Betsy, they go to the airport. She's the only one, right?
Well, right. So that's the next case. But what I present in my book, and I don't tell the reader this is the fact of the matter. What I do is I present all of this evidence, and I state the totality of all of this leads me to believe that this was not a suicide. It was a homicide that was staged to look like a suicide. I believe, I don't know this, but I believe that David Steagle was lying asleep in his bed in a comfortable sleeping position. Whoever else was in the house with him, and I can tell you what we know from the records, Sandra was in the house. She said, I was sleeping in another room. We can only make the inference because she said I didn't find him till the next morning. She didn't hear the gunshot. Now, I took that same pistol and I conducted experiments firing that pistol in a closed space. So it's February, it's cool outside. The windows and the doors to the house are closed. The percussion is formidable. And I didn't risk my ears. I risked a friend's ears.
Good job.
Was wearing. I stood back from a cracked window, and I told a friend of mine,
Dr. McCullough.
not Dr. McCullough, just a friend of mine that I was shooting with. I said, I'm going to fire it out the window. You stand back by the door and let me know how loud it is.
He didn't realize he was on a dummy mission. Now he knows John Leake's dummies missions.
So it's the percussion in the closed space. That's what it is. It's a 22 caliber long rifle cartridge, fires in the firing chamber with about 20,000 pounds per square inch. It comes blasting out of the muzzle and the ejection port, and it creates a percussion, and it's loud.
What are you going to say, Scott?
Do they still have the original evidence?
That I don't know.
Yeah, because you said some prosecutor may be able to bring this back up, but wouldn't you need like the gun?
Well, the physical evidence is evident in the photograph. So the prosecutor would have to be willing to make claims of physical evidence based on what is displayed in the photograph.
It's an amazing story. It's just mind blowing.
Well, so that's the first husband, and the police and the medical examiner conclude quite quickly this was a suicide. They believe it was a suicide, or that's their impression. And so that's 1975. Now, fast forward 1982. Sandra's second husband, Bobby, has died of lymphoma. Okay? And while he was dying, she gets to know, as the patient's wife, she gets to know his treating physician. His name is Dr. John Bagwell, and he has a wife named Betsy Bagwell, who's a 40-year-old woman. The story of Betsy Bagwell is the dramatic and moral heart of this story. Because with David Steagle, the first husband, you say, well, it kind of looked like a suicide. There's no reason to suspect this woman based on any kind of suspicious past. We'll just let it go. Okay. But with Betsy Bagwell, okay, now this is getting, the plot is thickening. Yeah. So Betsy tells her friends with whom she has lunch half an hour before she runs this final fateful errand with Sandra. She tells her friends at the country club over lunch, Sandra is driving me nuts. She keeps showing up at her house. I'm sorry that my husband was not able to save her husband's life from cancer. He did the best he could, but she is just killing me. I mean,
didn't she show up when they were on vacation in New Mexico?
And
They were
Santa
on
Fe.
like a husband-wife vacation, and there she is.
And she shows up in Santa Fe at their vacation home, and she is, well, it's called stalking.
Stalking, yeah.
And so she says, Sandra keeps coming to me and saying that her car is broken down. But then it kind of resolves and starts up again, and then it dies again. And, we keep having to run out to give her rides. And so I finally, I've told her, like, you need to get your vehicle repaired. How about renting a car? And so she tells her friends, I'm going to give Sandra a ride to Love Field Airport.
Let her rent a car, and maybe that will get rid of her.
Correct.
Right?
Okay. Betsy is last seen alive giving Sandra a ride to Love Field Airport, apparently to rent a car, because her own car keeps breaking down. Okay. Shall we look at...
Mm-hmm. Can you pull up the one with the car? This is, to me, this is like, and they were trying to get rid of her, but when she went and kicked him out of his own house when he's got cancer because she wanted to remodel it.
So, okay. So you're bringing up an important point before we go there.
Play it.
We were talking earlier about lack of empathy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when her husband Bobby is diagnosed with lymphoma, it looks at first like he might lick it, okay? And his doctor in Dallas gives him very strong chemotherapy. But then it comes back, the cancer comes back with a vengeance, and by the time you get to the spring or winter of 1982, it's apparent, the writing's on the wall, he's a goner. Now, at that moment, you would think, well, my spouse will soon pass away. This is a time of comfort and consolation. It was at this moment where Bobby probably just had another month or two to live that she decided to remodel the house. She liked remodeling. She liked home furnishings and decor. And so she actually moves Bobby out. He is initially placed in the care of an old family friend. She's a high school teacher in her 70s. She looks after him for a while. Then Bobby's father catches wind of this and says, this is outrageous. They own a hotel. He says, let's at least put him in a nice hotel suite. He's never welcomed back into his home. And she keeps saying it's because the remodeling or the HVAC installation is dragging on. But he's never welcomed back into his home. And a lot of people in our community perceive that to be a profound lack of empathy, a callousness. And I explore that through witnesses in detail in my book. But Bobby dies. And then 2 months later, she's showing a real interest in the doctor, the cancer doctor, Bobby's treating physician, and keeps showing up, and her car keeps breaking down and all of this mysterious stuff. So Betsy tells her friends, I'm desperate to get this woman out of my hair. She's driving me nuts. I'm going to do this favor this afternoon, and hopefully it will resolve her car trouble. And that's when she's last seen alive. So if you want to...
Was a Mercedes-Benz mechanic. His name is Lloyd Durrett. Pulled up next to this powder blue Mercedes station wagon. And he said to his children who were along for the ride, one of these days I'll save up enough to get a family car like that. And that prompted the curiosity of his children, who then went and peered into it. and they saw the body of a woman lying across the center console. Her entire upper body was on the right, the passenger seat. Her head was actually bumping the passenger side door. The one thing that you'll notice about this garage is you think, well, it's a crowded parking garage, you know, surely there's a lot of people around, but you'll notice you can't see very well into these vehicles. There's this kind of glare from the overhead lighting. I don't think anyone is aware right now that I'm here. I don't think anyone sees me. It's full, but as we stand here and look around, there's no one around. Had it not been for Lloyd's children, who were curious about the car, who walked up to look at it, these little kids that are about this high, who knows when Betsy's body would have been found? Her car did not have this large center console, so this is not ideal. But she's found with both legs and hips on the right side of the steering wheel, and her head all the way over like this. So if this door were to close, it would actually be in contact with her head. And the pistol is wedged between her thigh and the gear shift. Like the David Steagle death scene, there are very clear elements of staging in this. Her body was obviously moved after the shot was fired. The right hand braced between the thigh and the gear shift. This was clearly manipulated by someone else. The parking ticket for Love Field, it's stuck down between the muzzle and the laminated ashtray cover. That is another piece of staging. And the timestamp on the parking ticket is what the police used to reconstruct the timeline of Betsy's death. Glaring thing that's noted in the medical examiner field agent's report is that there's blood spatters in the back seat. He notes that in his report. Following the logic of suicide, the bucket seat has these lateral supports. Had she shot herself in the head, we would not expect her to have held on with the weapon and then have it be found braced between her thigh and the gear shift like this. She just dropped the weapon, it would be found next to her, something like that. And she would have just slumped down into the seat. Slump down in the seat just almost like you're falling asleep or something.
Okay.
Okay, and then I'm just going to put some lateral pressure on you. And where you can see how your leg is getting hung on the bottom of the steering wheel.
Yeah.
And then your head is not nearly as far over on the passenger seat.
And my left thigh still stuck there under the wheel.
Okay. All right. Now, how much effort is involved in scooting all the way over and getting your thighs and hips to clear? Yeah.
I think that might be.
Okay. So you actually had to sort of shift around, didn't you?
Yep.
The other thing that we can talk about, and that's clearly displayed in the photos, the bloodstain patterns in this case, okay? Blood has dropped down onto her right thigh, okay? So at some point she was sitting in this position. Blood dropped either from her nose or from the gunshot wound onto her right thigh. It then ran down her right thigh and dried. When she was found, you can clearly see that the blood had run in this direction and dried, but when she's rotated to the right, the blood appears to be running uphill, which we know is impossible. This is a unambiguous proof that her body was moved well after the shot was fired and the blood dried.
That one you can't. What do you have to say about that one? I mean,
interestingly enough, the consultant, Lynn Harold, she was a senior criminalist at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Crime Lab for 30 years. She found the parking ticket, and I did a lot of experiments, and I got people to find a Mercedes, and we did all of these testing with this. Lynn concluded, or she believes, that there is absolutely no way the pistol just came down and just happens to be pinning the parking ticket against it's like a laminated walnut ashtray cover. And if you look at it from different angles in the different photos, you see, were it not for the muzzle pressed against it, it would have slipped down to the top of the gear shift. That, and Lynn's, she believes, is the most incontrovertible piece of evidence that this was staged, that it was a homicide staged to look like a suicide. Now the blood stain, the blood that appears to be flowing uphill. There's something that I didn't go into here, but I do go into in my book. There's blood smears on the passenger seat, where you can see that her body she didn't just slump to the right. That had she just slumped to the right, you wouldn't have had the smearing on the back of the seat. Yeah. So there's numerous indications. You have the physical evidence in the photographs, and then you have this documented pattern of behavior on the part of Sandra just before and just after Betsy was found.
And unlike the previous, he was stressed out, had to borrow money from his dad, boom. Now, this woman just wanted to get rid of her. Like everything that you would think was, okay, we're going to rent her this car and maybe this will get her out of our hair. This woman had there was no evidence of any reason she would want to die, right?
Yeah, the problem for Betsy was that Sandra was trying to eliminate her so that she could move into Betsy's place, beautiful house, the Santa Fe vacation home, the yacht club membership.
Sure.
Sandra was trying to take Betsy's place. Okay, now that is where the plot really thickens in this story.
Mm-hmm.
And I one might have to just read the book at that point. But like, what is going on between Sandra and Betsy's husband, the treating oncologist? That's the big question.
What is really going on, right?
And so the one thing that is clear is that if you look at the Dallas police records from the year 1982, the doctor whose wife has just been found shot at Love Field, he's strangely silent. I mean, there's almost no record of him saying anything to the police. And then when you look at this D Magazine feature 5 years later, he declined to be interviewed for it. He declined my interview request. He fell completely silent on this. And it was therefore very revelatory for me when I was able to obtain a interview transcript of an interview that he gave not to the Dallas police in 1982, but to the Oklahoma police in 1986. Okay, so I can't find him making any statements to the Dallas police in 82, but when the Oklahoma City police come to Dallas in the spring of 86, investigating the murder of Sandra's third husband, they hear that Betsy was found shot in her car. And they say, well, maybe we ought to talk to this guy's, to the decedent's husband. So they, as I learned when I obtained the transcript, they interviewed him in 86 4 years after Betsy's case was closed and ruled a suicide. And he was pretty forthcoming in that interview.
Anything good that sticks out?
He just says, I know that Sandra killed my wife. I mean, I know
he
that
says
she
it
did.
flat out.
I know that she was instrumental. And he describes following Betsy's death, Sandra continued to stalk him. He tells the Oklahoma City police 4 years later. What's weird about it is at the time the case was open, I can't find any indication that he's telling the Dallas police any of this.
And why do you think that is?
That is a question that has perplexed my community for the last 40 years. Like, why? What's going on here? Like, he doesn't seem forthcoming at the time the case is actually open. I mean, she's found shot, case closed 6 days later. Like, where is he? What is he communicating to the police during this time frame, this critical time frame when the case is open? So I go pretty deep into all of this.
Yeah, you do. And again, like you've been saying, when you accumulatively put it all together, it's all similar. Somebody involved in the investigation doesn't want to talk. Another person doesn't want to do an autopsy or whatever. They just want to chalk it up and be done with it and move on.
And Sandra, it is my belief that she had this understanding, okay, that when Betsy's found and it looks like a suicide, that's what it looks like, there's not going to be anyone who's going to challenge that. She correctly estimated no one is going to challenge that perception. Now, strangely enough, and I didn't think he would talk to me, but I ran down Sandra's attorney at the time, okay? And he talked to me.
What'd he have to say? In short, so, it's in there, but...
He said, first of all, you're the first, all of these years, you're the first reporter that's ever come to me. And he said,
It's mind-blowing.
I mean, well, maybe the assumption is attorney-client privilege that I wouldn't talk, that my lips would be zipped. He said, but I will tell you some things. And I was surprised. I didn't think that he would, but he said shortly after Mrs. Bagwell was found shot, Sandra came into my office and she said, well, I'm having a bit of a problem. It would seem that Dr. Bagwell is upset with me. And the attorney said, well, why is he upset with you? And she said, well, I've told some of my friends that I was having an affair with him. And he doesn't like it that I've told my friends that. And he told me that if I didn't quit talking about this, saying this, making this representation, that I'd be hearing from his attorney. And the lawyer said, okay, so what do you want me to do? And she said, if you hear from his attorney, I want you to represent me. If you hear from his attorney, I want you to tell him I was just telling the truth. And I have hotel receipts to prove it. And she presents hotel receipts. She's claiming, this is her claim, that I documented our trysts in hotels with these receipts. So I immediately asked the attorney, how are they authenticated? Like, and he says, I don't know. She said these were the receipts. So when Dr. Bagwell's attorney called me, I said, look, according to my client, what she told her friends is factual reality. She was having an intimate relationship with Dr. Bagwell, and moreover, she has hotel receipts to prove it. And at that moment, this is according to the attorney, this isn't my representation, or sir, her attorney told me at that point, Dr. Bagwell's attorney said, oh,
Yeah.
and he said, I never heard from that attorney again. So the plot thickens even further in all of this, and I go into this in my book. Dr. Bagwell's attorney is an old family friend of mine. My mom's known him since they were kids. His wife was one of the women who Betsy met at the Dallas Country Club just before her death. His wife has also been silent.
You're stirring up stuff in the neighborhood there, John.
And it turns out as well that Dr. Bagwell's attorney who represented him in this controversy with Sandra, he also is the attorney, and he told me this on the phone. He was also the attorney that did the legal review of the D Magazine piece.
Oh man.
So this is the milieu in which Betsy was shot. And Sandra claims, hey, we were just having an affair. Now, what's really clever about all of this, in my estimation, it seems to me, Sandra said to the Dallas police, okay, she actually shows up at the Bagwell residence that night while the police are there informing Dr. Bagwell. And she says, Dr. Bagwell called me at a restaurant asking me if I'd seen Betsy. I got scared thinking, oh no, I hope nothing has happened to Betsy. So I've come over here to find out what happened to Betsy. And she looks at Dr. Bagwell. She looks at the police.
The innocent.
And so then I'm making an inference because it's noted in the police report that this interview that she spoke to the Dallas police on the evening of Betsy's death. And Dr. Bagwell told the Oklahoma City police as well. She came to my house that night. She tells the Dallas police homicide detective, I spent the day with Betsy and she wanted to talk with me about her despondency. She's not been doing well. She referenced a possible affair. She referenced a nurse at the hospital. So Dr. Bagwell worked at the hospital. And she wanted to talk to me about suicide. And the reason she wanted to talk to me about suicide is she heard that my first husband had committed suicide. So that's why we were together just before she committed suicide.
Ooh,
so
the kahunas.
It's quite interesting because it would only be logical to infer the Dallas County medical examiner is going to see this isn't the first suicide of whom I was the last known contact. They're going to see my first husband, who was also shot in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Okay, so instead of trying to conceal that, she actually tells the Dallas police that's why Betsy wanted to talk to me shortly before she killed her.
She's good. Nothing better than being proactive in that situation, showing right up.
Inserting herself in the investigation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to be clear on this. These are the facts that I was able to discover in my 5 years of investigation. This is the pattern, based on police documents, photographs, witness testimony, police records, interview transcripts. All of this, the totality of all of this, leads me to believe that these first two deaths were not suicides, they were homicides. They're part of the same series as the death of the third husband 2 years later, of which Sandra remains the prime suspect. So to me, when I look at all of this together, it leads me to believe that she is an undetected serial killer, officially undetected. She's long been under suspicion, but when I look at all of this and I put all of this together, it leads me to believe that, in fact, the suspicions are well-founded.
And how many killings until they label a person a serial killer?
2 or more.
It's 2 or more, right?
Mm. So, Tommy, what we can say is that all of this warrants a thorough reevaluation and investigation. I believe the Dallas County District Attorney's Office should reopen the matter of David Steagle, Betsy Bagwell, and Alan Rarig, and do a proper reevaluation of all of this. And I welcome them to start with the evidence that I present in my book, which I curated and analyzed with modern forensic expert or contemporary forensic experts.
When I go on Google and just Google the situation, Alan's family, they were relentless. I mean,
His mother,
right?
His mother,
yeah,
and that's another. I think Alan's mother is Alan's mother and Jane Todd, the Brunswick County, North Carolina Sheriff's deputy, and an investigative reporter in Dallas named Glenna Whitley. I think these three women. There was also a private investigator named Carrie Huskinson. So these four women, I think, are really the redemptive characters in this story. I mean, they really tried to do what was right for truth and justice, particularly Alan's mom, Gloria.
Yeah, she's in there a lot. And on Google, she's a lot. Like, she really, but that's what, when you have a son and a mother that really loves her. They, like my mother, no matter what I did, I was right. If something would have happened to me, she would have fought to figure it out until the day she died,
It's interesting to contrast the bond of affection between man and woman, a sexual bond, which is fickle, or not always fickle, but often fickle, and the bond of love and affection between a mother and child, which is, provided it's a good mother, it's the most unbreakable bond there is in the whole world. Yeah.
Now, this book was really written well. How many pages was this before published?
Well, I mean, I think in standard 11.5 font, kind of normal spacing, I think it's 416 pages.
But I mean, what was it when, you had written it? Was it 700 and then you chopped it down?
No, I didn't. I have worked that way before on previous books. I had a very good sense of this narrative, and I quickly perceived the story is really structured around the death of Betsy Bagwell, because there was a complete failure of my community and of law enforcement to properly investigate this. And the reason why I think that has such dramatic and moral significance is because not only did the failure to investigate that death properly result in what I believe to be the perpetrator getting away with it, it also enabled the perpetrator, in my estimation, to remain free in order to meet this young man from Oklahoma City just 2.5 years later. And then just a year after she married him, he's found shot to death. So I think that is quite a shock. I mean, it's like, okay, there's a failure to investigate, a failure to properly communicate with law enforcement. The perpetrator, I believe, and in my opinion, was able to get away with it. That's one thing. That's bad enough. It's another thing that another innocent young man or human then was subsequently murdered.
And the people around them too. Everyone suffers.
Yeah.
It's just wild.
His friends and family, his mother especially.
Isn't it so wild that this is your hometown?
It is. It is strange.
But
It is strange, and it prompted me to see my hometown and my community in a light in which I'd never seen it. And I think that, it's interesting. Sandra actually was also a theater producer.
No way.
She produced one off-Broadway play. Yeah, and I love this because I love the author.
Mm-hmm.
She produced an off-Broadway theater adaptation of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. about a guy who commits a murder that turns into a double murder, and he's so crushed with guilt about what he's done, he's overwhelmed with the perception there is no justification for this. Even though the old pawnbroker in the story is this horrible woman, like, my moral justification doesn't hold water, and he's overwhelmed with guilt, and it's about this character and his struggle with his conscience and with God. It's interesting to me that Sandra produced that off-Broadway adaptation of Crime and Punishment about 10 days before Alan Rehrig was murdered.
Seems like that was her therapy, maybe, in a sense.
One of the many strange moments in this story is that, so you produced an off-Broadway adaptation of Dostoevsky's Crime, which is about, it's the ultimate literary expression of the catastrophe of murder, of the moral and spiritual disaster of treating another human being as for utility, like just to get rid of them, for money in this case, because he steals the pawnbroker's money. And then he's so guilty about it that he like throws it in an alley and runs away from it. I think if I'm remembering, there was an actual New York Times review of this,
of the play,
of the premiere, and I think it's 3 weeks later, Alan is murdered.
What a shame.
And he didn't know because they were separated during the month of November. So the premiere of the play was, I think, November the 17th, 1985. During that month of November, Alan wasn't living with Sandra. He didn't know about this Broadway or this New York theater production. And it's interesting, she was legally, her name at the time was Rehrig. She married, murdered. She married Alan and took his surname. But in the New York Times credit of the play and the review, she's credited as Sandra Bridewell, not Rehrig. So she'd already decided, I'm not Sandra Rehrig anymore. I'm going back to my my more ritzy sounding name, Bridewell. And I love her name too. I mean, Bridewell.
Bridewell. Yeah.
Bridewell. Yeah.
That fits you perfect, honey.
Yeah.
Right? Well, you did a really good job with this one.
Thank you.
I really think this is really unbelievable. It's one of those books you put down for a second because you have to, because you can't understand, like, how is this happening? What's the best place for people to get everything and dig into it? And I guarantee you, after one chapter, you will finish it, even if you don't like reading.
I will say, normally I don't toot my own horn, but I've had multiple people say they canceled dates, didn't go to major social events because they were so engrossed in the book. So anyway, I am getting unsolicited good reviews on the book. You can find it on Amazon, The Meaning of Malice. You can also find me on my author page, authorjohnleake.com. And the book has a page as well, meaningofmalice.com. And then my documentary and film trailer are on my YouTube page, Author John Leake at YouTube.
We'll have all that at the very top before anything else. It's really it's the best book I've read or heard in the last decade.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Now, I would like to emphasize to you and to your audience that, to my knowledge, Sandra is still alive.
Oh.
And she's free.
And she's free.
And she's free.
So how old would she be right now? 44?
She will turn 80 in April. And so I want to say something if Sandra watches this. That title, The Meaning of Malice, that comes from something you, Sandra, said in your interview with the sheriff's deputy. His name is suddenly, not Jane Todd, Marty Folding. You, Sandra, if you're watching this, you gave an interview with Marty Folding in which you talked about the meaning of malice. Okay. I wrote this book without malice. I was just curious to understand what is the truth of all of this. And I've been very, very fair and very thorough. I've just worked with the facts of this.
And I want to back you with that in case she does see this. Before we came on, you had said to me that with this one, I want to be very strict with the facts, not a lot of goofy, I want to be very factual with this. You said that to me right before we came on. So if she does check this out, you were very stern with that.
I was, and I sympathize with Sandra with the hardships that she endured. Her mother getting killed in a car accident. I mean, I can't imagine.
That awful stepmom.
Yeah. I mean, all of this can only produce sympathy for a woman who suffered like this, and then the death of her second husband, Bobby, who everybody loved. But her conduct with her first husband, with Betsy Bagwell, Dr. Bagwell's wife, and then with Alan Rarig, I mean, I believe the facts speak for themselves.
All right, John, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I can't thank you enough. Thank you, Scott. And get the book, watch the documentary. You will not be disappointed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tommy.